For months, Allied planners believed that crossing the Rhine would require a massive, coordinated operation. The river was wide, the current swift, and every major bridge was thought to be destroyed or heavily defended. Eisenhower's headquarters estimated that it might take until late spring to establish a firm bridgehead east of the river. Yet on the morning of March 7, 1945, fate, and a handful of determined American soldiers, would rewrite that plan. South of Bonn, in the small German town of Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge stretched across the Rhine. It was a massive steel structure built during the First World War, over 1,000 feet long, supported by two stone towers that looked more like castle fortifications than modern engineering. The bridge had survived years of bombing and retreating troops, though now, as the Allies approached, German demolition engineers had prepared it for destruction. The charges were set, the orders were clear. No Allied soldier would cross. On the Allied side, the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges was advancing rapidly. Among its spearhead units was the 9th Armored Division, commanded by Brigadier General John W. Leonard. His orders were simple: reach the Rhine, secure crossings if possible, and prepare for the larger assault to follow. But nobody expected an intact bridge. At around noon on March 7th, a small reconnaissance patrol from Combat Command B approached Remagen. Leading the column was Lieutenant Karl Timberman of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. From a nearby ridge, the men peered through binoculars at the valley below and froze. There it was, the Ludendorff Bridge, standing intact, spanning the Rhine like a silver blade. The sight defied every expectation. Lieutenant Timberman radioed back immediately. His superior, Major General John W. Leonard, relayed the message up the chain. Bridge intact at Remagen. Within minutes, higher command began to buzz with disbelief. General Hodges, upon hearing the report, asked simply, "Can they take it?" The answer came back, "They're going to try." On the opposite bank, German forces under Major Hans Scheidt were in chaos. The order to destroy the bridge had already been given days earlier, but shortages of explosives and confusion among engineers had delayed the process. Demolition teams had rigged the bridge with what little TNT they had, far less than standard procedure required. Even worse, communication with higher command had broken down. When the Americans appeared on the western slopes above Remagen, Scheidt's men were still unsure whether to blow the bridge or hold it. As the first shells from American tanks began to land on the town, panic set in. German soldiers rushed to the towers, frantically checking fuses and detonators. A column of smoke rose as one of the charges detonated prematurely, blasting a hole in the bridge's deck, but the main structure held firm. The explosion that should have sent the bridge tumbling into the Rhine instead only damaged its surface. Against every probability, the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. For the soldiers of the 9th Armored Division, this was an opportunity beyond imagination. They could make history, or die trying. As one sergeant later put it, "You don't find a bridge to Germany every day." Orders came swiftly: secure the bridge, cross if possible, and hold the far bank. The Rhine, the last great obstacle of Hitler's empire, lay open before them. What followed would become one of the most daring and unexpected moments of the entire European war. A battle fought not only for a bridge, but for the momentum that would carry the Allies to victory. As word spread through the ranks of the 9th Armored Division, disbelief turned to urgency. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it wouldn't last. Every soldier knew the Germans could detonate the bridge at any moment. Lieutenant Karl Timberman's men crouched along the railway embankment west of Remagen, staring through smoke and dust at their prize. The Rhine glistened beyond, calm and indifferent. The town itself was chaos. German machine gun nests, panicked civilians, and retreating soldiers all tangled together in confusion. Colonel Leonard Engemann, commander of Combat Command B, gave the order: take the bridge at all costs. There was no time for detailed planning. Artillery could not be used heavily. It risked destroying the very target they hoped to seize. Instead, Small infantry teams, tanks, and engineers would advance under covering fire, pushing directly into Remagen's narrow streets. It was the kind of operation that could end in disaster or glory. At 2 p.m., the assault began. Shermans of the 14th Tank Battalion rolled forward, their guns hammering German positions on the western bank. Infantry from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion followed closely, darting between shattered buildings, exchanging bursts of gunfire with defenders in the towers. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid, mixing with the sharp scent of burning oil. Civilians huddled in cellars as the Americans stormed through. Lieutenant Jack Hyland, leading one of the first squads, later recalled, "We expected the whole bridge to blow at any second. Every step felt like walking on borrowed time." As his men advanced toward the bridge entrance, they could see the demolition cables snaking along the decking leading into the towers. Engineers quickly began cutting them with wire cutters, praying they weren't too late. On the far side, Major Hans Scheidt gave the fateful order, "Detonate!" The German engineer in charge pressed the plunger. A muffled boom echoed, but instead of the thunderous collapse everyone expected, only a small explosion shook the western span. Dust billowed, fragments fell, yet the bridge remained standing. The charges had failed again. Panic erupted among the German defenders. Some scrambled for rifles, others for fresh detonators. But before they could regroup, American fire intensified. Tanks fired point-blank at the towers. Machine guns swept the bridge approaches. Several German soldiers attempted to flee across, only to be cut down mid-span. The air was alive with ricochets, tracer fire, and shouted orders. At 3 p.m., the first wave of Americans began their dash across. Lieutenant Timberman's platoon led the charge, followed by a handful of combat engineers carrying wire cutters and demolition tools. Bullets cracked around them as they sprinted across the open span. 1,000 feet of exposed steel. Every clang of a boot on the girders echoed like a countdown. Above, the bridge's arched trusses offered little cover. Below, the Rhine churned, cold and merciless. Halfway across, Sergeant Alexander Drabik paused to fire his rifle at the tower windows. He became the first American soldier to cross the Rhine in combat. Moments later, more followed, crouching behind the steel beams, returning fire with carbines and grenades. German defenders in the eastern tower fought fiercely, but confusion and fear overwhelmed them. Within minutes, the Americans reached the far end and began clearing the bunkers. Behind them, engineers raced to disarm remaining charges. Private First Class Delbert H. Jacobson crawled along the bridge's edge, cutting wires as snipers fired from across the river. He later said, "I didn't think I'd live through it. I just kept cutting until there was nothing left to cut." His actions, and those of countless others that day, kept the bridge intact long enough for reinforcements to cross. By dusk, the Americans had established a precarious foothold on the east bank. Roughly 120 men of the 9th Armored Division held their ground against scattered German counterattacks. The Ludendorff Bridge, scarred and smoking, stood firm, a miracle of steel and luck. Messages flashed across Allied radio networks. Bridge at Remagen captured intact. In command headquarters miles away, General Eisenhower could hardly believe it. He turned to his staff and said quietly, "That bridge is worth its weight in gold." The impossible had happened. The Allies had crossed the Rhine, not in weeks or months, but that very day. Yet the victory was fragile. The Germans were regrouping, and the battle for the bridge had only just begun. News of the bridge's capture spread like wildfire, not only through the Allied ranks, but deep within the corridors of the crumbling German war machine. For Hitler, it was a humiliation beyond words. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's natural shield, the line his generals had sworn would hold. Yet now American troops were on the eastern bank, standing on German soil. The Führer's rage was volcanic. Orders were barked through every chain of command. Destroy that bridge at all costs. In the Allied camp, the mood was triumphant but tense. The engineers had stabilized the structure as best they could, but the Ludendorff Bridge groaned under the weight of constant shell fire and the rumble of tanks crossing its span. Each tremor felt like a warning. American units worked through the night to expand their foothold on the far bank, establishing defensive positions in the villages of Erpel and Linz. Every man knew the Germans would strike back at dawn. The counterattack came with brutal speed. At first light on March 8th, artillery from the east bank began to pound the bridge relentlessly. Shells screamed overhead and exploded around the approaches, throwing fountains of dirt and debris skyward. Snipers, hidden in the hills, picked off engineers working on repairs. The Americans responded with their own guns, blasting the opposite slopes in a duel that turned the valley into a cauldron of smoke and noise. Meanwhile, the German command was scrambling to assemble every available unit in the region. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, remnants of Volkssturm militias, and hastily formed engineer battalions converged on Remagen. Their mission was suicidal but clear: retake the bridge or destroy it. Some carried explosives, others only rifles and desperation. The Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, was ordered to intervene. At noon, the first German aircraft appeared over the Rhine, aging Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Me-262 jet fighters, their engines howling across the valley. Bombs whistled down toward the bridge, but most missed their mark, detonating harmlessly in the water or on the far shore. Allied anti-aircraft guns responded instantly, filling the sky with black puffs of flak. One jet disintegrated in midair, showering fragments over the river. It was chaos, but the bridge still stood. On the ground, German frogmen from the elite Kleinkampfverbände were dispatched to sabotage the structure from below. They launched at night, paddling small rubber boats downriver, towing explosive charges meant to detonate against the bridge's piers. But searchlights and machine gun fire from the American side caught them before they reached their target. Most never made it back. In nearby towns, terrified German civilians watched as the front line rolled over them again. Many had believed the Rhine would protect them, that the Americans could not cross. Now, they huddled in basements as both sides traded fire above. One resident of Erpel later wrote, "We no longer knew who was attacking whom." The bridge was alive, roaring, burning, yet unbroken. For the Americans, each passing hour meant survival and reinforcement. Engineers worked furiously to strengthen the structure with steel beams and wooden planks. Trucks carried ammunition and supplies across continuously, while wounded men were ferried back in jeeps. The bridge had become both a lifeline and a target, and everyone on it was aware that a single lucky shell could bring it all down. At German headquarters in Bonn, General Alfred Jodl briefed Hitler personally. His words were cautious, his tone subdued. The Führer interrupted with an outburst that echoed through the bunker. "Those responsible for this disgrace will be punished." Within days, several officers, including Major Scheidt and his engineers, were arrested by the Gestapo and later executed for cowardice and failure. The Remagen disaster had become not just a military defeat, but a political purge. Still, the attacks continued. On March 9th, dive bombers struck again, this time guided by radar. They scored near misses that shook the structure but failed to destroy it. By now, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed, forming a solid bridgehead east of the Rhine. The bridge that should have delayed the Allies for months was now funneling an entire army into the heart of Germany. For the men defending it, the battle had become a test of endurance. The Ludendorff Bridge stood like a wounded giant, twisted, burning, and riddled with holes, yet still defying gravity and fate. Each hour it remained standing shortened the war. By March 10, 1945, the impossible had become reality. The Allies held a firm bridgehead across the Rhine, Germany's last great defensive line, and reinforcements were pouring in faster than the enemy could react. What began as a daring dash across a steel bridge had transformed into a full-scale invasion. For the men of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, there was little time to celebrate. The fight for Remagen was far from over. The Ludendorff Bridge groaned beneath an endless stream of trucks, tanks, and jeeps. Engineers worked around the clock, shoring up its damaged beams with timber and steel braces. The structure trembled with every vehicle that crossed, each vibration sending shivers through the men below. "We were crossing history," one sergeant later said, "and praying it wouldn't collapse under us." On the eastern bank, the Americans dug in. The villages of Erpel, Linz, and Bruckhausen became miniature fortresses, each street fortified with sandbags and machine gun nests. Patrols pushed outward, clearing pockets of resistance in nearby woods and hills. German snipers haunted the ridgelines, firing sporadically at engineers and medics. Artillery fire never truly ceased. It became the soundtrack of the bridgehead, distant booms, and the constant crack of incoming shells. General William Hoge, commander of the 9th Armored's Combat Command B, directed the crossing with relentless focus. He knew the bridge could be destroyed at any moment, and every soldier that made it across was one more step toward victory. By March 11th, over 8,000 troops and hundreds of vehicles had crossed. By March 12th, that number doubled. Bulldozers carved new roads through the muddy banks, and engineers began constructing additional pontoon bridges upstream and downstream to relieve the pressure on the Ludendorff. For the Germans, the situation was catastrophic. The once proud Rhine defense line had been breached in a place they had scarcely defended. Hitler's rage had turned to paranoia. He blamed the Luftwaffe, the engineers, even the weather. His generals scrambled to organize a counteroffensive, assembling whatever forces could be found. Remnants of the 67th Corps, ad hoc battalions of SS trainees, and Volkssturm militia armed with Panzerfausts and borrowed rifles. Yet each attempt to retake the bridgehead faltered under American artillery and air support. The Luftwaffe made one final push. On March 11th and 12th, waves of jet-powered Me-262s and rocket-armed Arado 234's bombers streaked toward the bridge at low altitude. Their attacks were daring, but ineffective. The speed of the jets made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Most bombs landed in the river, sending great plumes of water into the air. Allied anti-aircraft gunners claimed over 30 aircraft in 2 days. One pilot, captured after ejecting, reportedly told his captors, "Even if we hit it, there'd be 10 more tomorrow." Meanwhile, Allied engineers performed feats of ingenuity that bordered on the miraculous. Under constant fire, they built treadway bridges, floating steel platforms anchored by cables, capable of handling tanks and convoys. They worked waist-deep in freezing water, guided by searchlights masked under red filters. Every night, explosions flashed along the river, and every morning, the bridge still stood. The German attempts to destroy it were increasingly futile. Inside Remagen itself, life teetered between chaos and exhaustion. Civilians emerged from basements to find their town reduced to rubble. American medics treated wounded soldiers in makeshift aid stations inside churches and wine cellars. The smell of cordite and river mud hung heavy in the air. And yet, amid the wreckage, there was a sense of irreversible momentum, a feeling that the war's end was finally approaching. By March 13th, the Allied bridgehead extended several miles inland. Armored units were now advancing east, threatening to encircle German forces still holding out along the river. Eisenhower's headquarters, once cautious, now saw Remagen as a symbol, proof that German resistance was crumbling faster than expected. The Rhine, once hailed as Germany's eternal frontier, had been crossed in force. Still, every man who crossed knew the bridge's days were numbered. The Ludendorff had taken more damage than anyone could measure. Cracks snaked along its girders, rivets popped loose, and the deck plates shifted under the constant strain. Engineers could hear it groaning like an old ship in a storm. Yet it endured, carrying wave after wave of men and machines toward the final battles of the war. The bridge at Remagen had done more than connect two riverbanks. It had linked hope to inevitability. The question now was how long it would survive before gravity, steel, and fate took their toll. By mid-March 1945, the Ludendorff Bridge was no longer just a crossing. It was a symbol. Every Allied dispatch, every newspaper headline spoke of it. Soldiers across Europe whispered about the bridge that refused to die. For the Germans, it had become an obsession, a wound that refused to close, and for the men still guarding it, it was a ticking bomb made of steel and fatigue. The strain was relentless. Thousands of tons of vehicles had crossed the bridge in just 10 days, far more than its engineers had ever designed it to bear. American combat engineers inspected it constantly, measuring the widening cracks in the deck and listening to the metallic groans that echoed like warning sighs. Rivets rattled loose. Girders bowed under the constant vibration. It was like standing on the back of a dying beast, one soldier later recalled. Yet the orders remained clear: keep it open. Every hour the Ludendorff stood meant another column of tanks, another convoy of supplies, another battalion of infantry pushing into Germany. Engineers reinforced it with anything they could find: steel beams scavenged from rail cars, wooden planks from demolished houses, even railroad ties lashed together with wire. The bridge looked less like a military structure and more like a patchwork miracle held together by desperation. The Germans, unwilling to accept failure, launched one final series of attacks. On March 14th, artillery batteries positioned east of the river fired hundreds of shells. One shell hit near the bridge's western tower, collapsing part of the roadway. Several soldiers were killed instantly. The Luftwaffe followed with another desperate air raid, a few Me-262 jets strafing the approaches before vanishing into the clouds. None of the bombs struck true. Still, the Americans could feel the bridge weakening. Every crossing sent tremors through the structure that rippled down to the foundations. The engineers begged their commanders to limit traffic, but the orders from above were firm: the advance must continue. Across the river, pontoon bridges were nearly ready but not yet operational. The Ludendorff had to hold just a few more days. On March 17, 1945, at 3 p.m., the inevitable happened. The bridge was crowded with men and vehicles when a sharp cracking noise rang out, a sound distinct even amid the thunder of artillery. Witnesses later described it as a deep metallic scream, like steel tearing apart under immense strain. The center span began to buckle. Soldiers shouted warnings as the girders twisted and the decking split open. Within seconds, the entire middle section gave way, collapsing into the Rhine with a roar that echoed for miles. Men and equipment plunged into the freezing river below. Survivors recalled the horror: trucks sliding off the tilting deck, soldiers thrown into the air, and the deafening splash as tons of steel hit the water. Some tried to swim, weighed down by gear and debris. Rescue boats scrambled from both banks, pulling men from the current. 17 American engineers and soldiers were killed, dozens more injured. The Ludendorff Bridge, the miracle of Remagen, was gone. When news reached headquarters, there was no anger, only grim acceptance. The bridge had done more than anyone could have hoped. In just 10 days, it had carried over 25,000 troops, 2,500 vehicles, and massive amounts of equipment across the Rhine. By the time it fell, the Allies had already built multiple pontoon bridges nearby. The crossing was secure, the momentum unstoppable. That evening, as the fires burned low and divers searched the wreckage, General William Hoge stood on the riverbank watching the water swirl around the twisted remains of the bridge. "She died a hero," he said quietly. For many who had fought there, the Ludendorff was not just steel and stone. It was a living thing, a comrade that had given its all. In the following days, soldiers gathered fragments of the bridge as souvenirs, a piece of history in their pockets. Photographers captured the skeletal remains jutting from the river like broken ribs. The Germans, once confident in the Rhine as an impenetrable barrier, now saw it as a grave marker for the Reich itself. The bridge that had broken Hitler's front had finally broken itself. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally gave way on March 17, 1945, its fall did not slow the Allied advance. In truth, the crossing at Remagen had already achieved its purpose. Within days, 4 additional pontoon and Bailey bridges spanned the Rhine nearby, each capable of carrying tanks, artillery, and endless convoys of men and materiel. The Rhine, once the last line of German defense, was no longer a barrier. It was a highway leading straight into the heart of the Reich. For the soldiers who had fought at Remagen, the victory was both exhilarating and sobering. They had witnessed one of the war's defining moments, but also one of its most costly engineering battles. The men of the 9th Armored Division were praised across the Allied world. Eisenhower personally commended General William Hogue and his troops for their courage and speed. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the news with quiet satisfaction. "It seems," he said, "that our boys can cross anything they set their minds to." In Germany, however, the reaction was catastrophic. The loss of the bridge triggered one of Hitler's final purges. Furious that such a critical structure had fallen intact, he accused the officers responsible of treason and sabotage. Major Hans Scheidt, Captain Willy Bratke, and several engineers who had attempted, and failed, to destroy the bridge, were arrested by the Gestapo. After a brief, brutal court-martial, most were executed by firing squad. Even in its collapse, the Ludendorff Bridge continued to claim lives. For the German military, Remagen shattered a myth. For years, the Rhine had been described in Nazi propaganda as the eternal frontier, the river that no enemy could cross. Its fall destroyed that illusion completely. To the people of Germany, it signaled that the war was truly lost. Allied troops poured across the new bridges daily, advancing toward Cologne, the Ruhr, and eventually the Elbe. In just weeks, the U.S. Army surrounded nearly 300,000 German troops in the Ruhr pocket, a devastating encirclement that effectively ended organized resistance in the West. For the Allies, the crossing at Remagen offered more than a tactical victory. It was psychological. It proved that German resistance could be broken not just by overwhelming numbers, but by boldness and speed. Military historians would later call it an accident of war, a convergence of luck, timing, and courage. But for the men on the ground, it had felt like destiny. In the months that followed, the town of Remagen lay in ruins. Its people, stunned and weary, watched as Allied engineers dismantled what remained of the bridge's twisted arches. The Rhine, calm once more, carried away fragments of steel that had changed history. In 1950, the U.S. Army erected a plaque on the western bank to honor the soldiers who had fought and died there. The twin stone towers, blackened by fire and explosions, were left standing, silent witnesses to the moment when a river ceased to divide. Today, those towers house a peace museum. Inside, photographs line the walls, faces of young soldiers, both American and German, who fought at Remagen. There are rusted helmets, fragments of bridge girders, and a simple inscription that reads, "For 10 days this bridge carried the hope of freedom." The legacy of Remagen reaches beyond the battlefield. It marked the moment when the Allies proved that no obstacle, not a river, not a fortress, not even the myth of the Reich, could halt their advance. It also stands as a testament to human ingenuity under fire, to the courage of engineers, and to the countless soldiers who risked their lives not only to destroy, but to build. When the Ludendorff Bridge fell into the Rhine, it did not vanish. Its reflection lived on. In every crossing that followed, in every liberated town, in the peace that would slowly return to a broken continent. The bridge that broke Hitler's front had fulfilled its purpose, and in doing so, it helped end the war.